Well, hey, today is the last week of what I've been jokingly saying is a 2-year sermon series, but it's really only been 7 weeks, that we have called This is the Way. And if you're new with us this morning, we're kind of in the final week of this series, which means that you're kind of walking in, if this is your first time, you're kind of walking in on the final scene of a movie that's been playing for a while. But I'll just tell you, that's okay, because most of the people sitting around you have missed a few scenes along the way themselves. So you're in good company with them. But just to kind of get us all on the same page as we jump into the last week, I just want to catch us up real quick on kind of the foundation of this series, what we've been focusing on. And we said at the beginning of this series several weeks ago, we said that as a church, we have, it's honestly kind of an agenda, right? It's like one thing that drives us. It's the thing that we care most about. It's our mission. And we've said that our mission as a church is to inspire curiosity in the way of Jesus. And if you're new here and if you're hearing that for the first time, I just want you to know that we believe that one of the most, the best things we could offer you would be curiosity, because curiosity actually drives our growth, leads us to engage our questions, leads us to find out if there's something more for us in life and in the world. And we want to be most curious specifically about the way of Jesus, not just curious about Jesus, but curious about the way of living that Jesus taught and modeled to us. We don't want to be just the kind of people who talk a lot about Jesus, all right? The world has enough of people like that. We want to be the kind of people who actually live out the way that Jesus led us and modeled to us in his time on earth. And if we study what the way of Jesus looks like, just to kind of recap a little bit, if we study what the way of Jesus looks like, we've said throughout this series that it looks like 5 practices that we can implement and put into our life. Now, if you've been with us over the last several weeks, we've been going through these practices one by one, taking a practice a week. And we've been going through these in a different order than they're actually drawn, which has been very difficult for some of the type A people in the room, okay? I've heard your feedback on this, all right? But we've been going kind of out of order. So does anybody, just for fun, does anybody remember which practice we talked about first? It would have been 4 weeks ago. Rhythm, almost. That's the one at the top, not quite the... Community, there we go. Community was the first one that we talked about. Katie gave us a great message on community and encouraged us that the way of Jesus leads us to not just look to experience community for ourselves, but to create community for other people. Now, after community, we just jumped into the bottom of the list, which really threw some of you off, right? But we jumped down and we talked about generosity. We talked about what it looks like to live as if everything that we need has already been provided for us through our Heavenly Father. And from that position, we can be wildly generous to the world around us. Now, after generosity, we talked specifically about service and what it looks like to serve the world around us. And particularly, we talked about what it looks like to see the world around us and the ways that we're called to see the world around us. We said, hey, everybody in our world bears the image of our King, bears the image of God, and we're meant and intended to serve people in the same way that we would serve our Heavenly Father, right? After that, we talked last week. Which one was it, Rachel? Rhythm, nailed it. Yep, we talked about rhythm. Last week, David gave us a great message on what it looks like to actually prioritize rhythm and time with Jesus. And so today, it's going to be a really hard question. If you've been here the last few weeks, today we're going to talk specifically about, anybody want to guess? Storytelling, nailed it. Yeah, there you go. Process of elimination at that point. So today we're going to talk about storytelling. Now, stories, we'll just say this, stories are one of the most powerful things that we have in our world, right? There's something wildly powerful about a good story. I remember when I was a kid, we had a great-grandmother who was just this incredible storyteller. I mean, she could just weave words together in a way that captured your attention. And she was full of stories. I mean, when she retired and she was by herself, she was single, and she just took an Astrovan, converted the Astrovan into like a modified camper, and at 80 years old was just driving around the United States from state to state, just doing loops around the continental U.S., primarily just bird watching. I mean, just like her and her binoculars and her Astrovan, just bird watching. And then when she would make it around to where my family lived, she would usually stop in for a few days and just park that Astrovan in our driveway and just hang with us for a week. And my sister and I, we would just come, we would just gather around, we would just sit and we would just listen to the stories that she would tell us about her adventures and the stories she would tell us about her childhood. She would tell us stories about how she got 19 middle names, like why she was given 19. She swears legal, I never saw the birth certificate, but she swears legal middle names. She would tell us about the trouble that she would get into with her sisters and the ways that her dad would respond to them. And she would tell us all these different stories. We found out later in life that most of them weren't really all that true, or at least they'd been wildly embellished, but she was just this incredible storyteller. And stories have a way of just capturing our attention, drawing us in, and keeping us right there in that moment. And let's talk for a minute just about the impact that stories have on us, right? Like stories, if you think about it, stories give us identity, right? Don't they? Like we love sitting around and listening to our great-grandmothers or our grandmothers or our grandfathers or our great-uncle, older people in our lives, and hearing stories from them about our family and about them, because that actually gives us roots for our own stories. And their story becomes the context for our stories. They help define who we are as people. Stories do more than just that. Those stories also inspire us, don't they? I mean, there are times where we're motivated to believe that better things are possible because of a story that just moved us. There are times where we change the way that we act, or we start to operate in different ways because of the way that the story just moved us and inspired us. But even bigger than that, stories have the power to transport us, don't they? Like they can take us from the place that we're in to a completely different place without us actually physically moving at all, right? Like you can be in a movie theater and also be in a galaxy far, far away. Or you can be sitting on your couch and also find yourself in the Shire, so to speak. Or you can be in your house, but yet you're also in Andy's house, Like stories just have the ability to transport us from our world into a completely different world. And there's one more thing that stories have the power to do. This is what I think is kind of the biggest and most powerful things that they offer to us. Stories actually offer us an escape at times, don't they? Like stories actually give us the ability to take a break from our story when our story doesn't quite feel good enough, and move us into a different story. This is why for many of us at the end of a hard week, we just crash on the couch and put on a movie. This is why at times we find ourselves binge watching Netflix when we should be binging our to-do list, But instead we're sitting and watching show after show after show. This is why there's probably some correlation between your stress level and your screen time, Like stories just give us the opportunity to escape our stories and take a break when our story doesn't feel good enough, or when our story feels too hard, or when the chaos of the stories around us begin to overwhelm us. Now, there's one thing I hope to convince you of this morning, and I'm going to spend the rest of our time together really constantly just trying to convince you of this. The one thing I hope to convince you of is this: that you don't actually have to escape your story to experience a better story. You don't have to press pause on your story. You don't have to numb out. You don't have to find an escape. You don't have to tune it out and find something that feels better to get out of yours. You don't have to escape your story to experience a better story if, and this is a big if, but if you can see your story in light of a bigger story. To show you what I mean, first what we've got to do is understand the common thread that exists through every good story. So what I want to talk to you about for the next few minutes is this. I want to talk about the anatomy of a story, or in other words, the basic parts of every good story that honestly has ever moved you and ever inspired you. Donald Miller has some great work on this. There are some other storyteller researchers who have done great work on this. But if you look at every story that's ever moved you, they all have the same basic parts. Every story that's ever moved you began with some type of a setting. I'm just going to use abbreviations here this morning, okay? It began in a setting. It began in a place. And within that place, you were introduced to a character. And that character, very quickly in the story, experienced a problem. That's not a very good circle. You'll live with it, right? That character experiences a problem. And with that problem, as he or she seeks to solve that problem, the character encounters a guide, someone who comes alongside them to help them solve that problem. And that guide leads them to a point of action, a step to take, it usually involves some level of courage. It usually involves them moving beyond something that's been holding them back even before the problem existed. And that action that they take is going to lead them in one of two directions. It either leads them towards success or it leads them to failure. Now, again, think about this. Every story that has ever moved you, I would be willing to bet, has followed this thread. Think about it like this. If you're a fan of the Lord of the Rings, where's my Lord of the Rings fan over here? Was it Anthony? There we go, right? If you're a fan of the Lord of the Rings, okay? If you take just from the very beginning, right? We find ourselves in this set in the Shire. We're introduced to Frodo. And Frodo experiences a problem, just like everyone else around him experiences a problem. The problem is that Sauron is starting to amass power, and he's trying to basically take over and destroy Middle-earth, okay? And Frodo, with this problem, experiences a guide by the name of Gandalf. And Gandalf leads Frodo to a point of action. He has to destroy the ring, really before the ring destroys him, before everyone else is destroyed. And his choice to take that action is either going to lead to success, the Shire is saved, or all of Middle-earth is saved, or it's going to lead to failure as Sauron takes control. Right? Or take Star Wars, for example. Star Wars starts out in a setting far, far away, with a character, Luke Skywalker, who experiences a problem. The problem that he's experiencing and everyone else is experiencing is that the Empire has developed a Death Star that can take out or annihilate just about any planet, right? And Luke experiences a guide. The first guide he experiences is Obi-Wan Kenobi. In later episodes, you got Yoda and others, but he experiences Obi-Wan Kenobi, who teaches Luke to use the Force. And his use of the Force is going to lead either to the destruction of the Death Star, or the Empire will continue to gain power and rule the galaxy, right? Like every story that's ever moved you has followed this thread line. Just for fun, also, every Hallmark movie that you may have watched or not watched has followed this plot line. Hear me on this, right? Every Hallmark movie has started like this. It starts out in some rural town with a city girl who somehow got stuck there, you know? And she's got a problem. You know what her problem is? She's too busy for love, right? So she runs into a guide. Now think about this. You're going to miss this. Every Hallmark movie has a sister or a mom or a friend who comes alongside her. It might be a 5-minute phone call, or it might be it's not an hour discussion because the movie's not that long. But you get my point. Has a guide who comes alongside her and tells her, you've got to put yourself out there. You've got to have courage. You've got to open yourself up to love. And if she doesn't, it's going to end in eternal loneliness. And if she does, it's going to end with a really nice kiss in the final scene, you know? Now, some of the newer Hallmark movies, it's getting weird because the kiss scene, they're actually moving that up in the plot line a little bit, which is kind of throwing things off. Don't ask me how I know that, okay? But it's just a little weird. All right, but my point is, this isn't new. This is the anatomy of every story that has ever moved or inspired you. Now, here's why I believe that's the case. I believe that's true, and I believe that's the case because from the beginning of time, this is also the anatomy or the basic parts of a story that the creator of the universe has been writing about you and about me and about all of humanity. And I actually believe that there's something in you that when you experience this, recognizes your creator calling out to you through the language of story. Because for all of time, he's been writing this story about you. And at the center of that story is a person who we've been talking about every week throughout the course of the series. In fact, it's the person we talk about every week at the Co. But at the very center of that story is the person of Jesus. And when you study the Gospels, you study these biographical accounts of Jesus, what you find is that the story of Jesus didn't begin in around 4 BC. It didn't begin at Christmas. The story of Jesus began at the beginning of time. John, one of Jesus' first followers, clues us in on this when he wrote his gospel. Okay, there's 4 gospels. If you study the scriptures, there's 4 gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they start their biographical accounts of Jesus in the same way that you would expect most historical accounts to start. Either with a genealogy that just kind of fills in the space of time, or they just start with the beginning of, of Jesus' life or the beginning of the time on earth that they're capturing of Jesus. But John, when he took the time, John was the fourth gospel to be written. John, when he spent time writing his gospel, he pulled out his pen and he wrote 3 words that were not new to John. In fact, these were 3 words that had been written thousands of years before in one of the texts, one of the portions of Scripture that John and all of his peers would have already been familiar with. And when John begins to capture the story of Jesus, he decides to start with these 3 words that had already been written well before John. John pulls out his pen and he puts it on page and he writes, "In the beginning." Now, regardless of your experience with the Scriptures and regardless of your experience with church, I'm willing to bet that you've heard those words before. Maybe in like a Morgan Freeman voice, "In the beginning." That was a really bad Morgan Freeman impression, okay? But you get the idea. Like you've heard these words. But where you likely heard these words from weren't from the book of John. They were from a book that was written thousands of years before John, a book known as Genesis. Just for fun, let's put both books side by side just for a minute, okay? So Genesis 1 starts like this. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And then John, thousands of years later, comes in and he starts his book, "In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, when he says the Word, you find out as you continue to read that he's referring to the person of Jesus. Now, when the author of Genesis wrote these words, the author of Genesis wrote these words to tell us about what God did. But when John writes these words, he writes these words to tell us about who God is. And if you remember just for a second what the author of Genesis has told us, he tells us about what God did and how God created the world. And how did God create the world? With his words. I mean, just for example, the first thing God created, the author of Genesis tells us that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and he says, "Then God said, 'Let there be light.'" He spoke it in word. And began to exist. And then look at what John says. John says he existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. It's as if John is trying to say to us, hey, I spent several years on this earth, spending every day with the person of Jesus. I watched him heal the sick. I watched him make the lame walk. I watched him give speech to mute. I watched him give hearing to the deaf. And after watching him, the best way I could describe this is it was as if all of that creative energy and power that formed the world existed within the body of that man. And so to understand the story of Jesus, I think John would tell us, we've got to actually begin with the story of creation. Because the story of Jesus actually begins there. And if you study Genesis, what you find really quickly is that we are given this setting that God creates. God creates the world and a few things that he creates, right? He creates a garden, right? Do my best here, see what kind of trees I can create. Oh, that's not bad. Oh, well, it got worse. All right, there we go. He creates a garden. He puts 2 trees in the middle of the garden. He puts what's referred to as the tree of life. And the other side, he puts what's referred to as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. One of the other things he creates right from the beginning is light. We already saw that. Let's add some of that in there. And then he goes on and he puts a character in the middle of that garden. He puts a man named Adam right there in the middle. You know what? Just for fun here, we'll fix this. Give him a little fig leaf here, you know. That's better. That helps, I think, right? It's a pretty good fig leaf. But he puts Adam right in the middle of that garden. Now, if you study the Hebrew text, that word Adam really would be Adam. It was a known Hebrew word. It wasn't like a new name that was created. It's a known Hebrew word that basically means man, or sometimes referred to humanity or mankind. So the point about this, and scholars debate, right? You'll find scholars who debate whether or not this is a literal garden or this is a figurative garden that they're giving us as a picture of the way that God first intended the world to be, regardless of which approach you take, right? The point of this is that this isn't just a story about Adam. This is a story about man. This is a story about you. It's a story about me, and it's about all of humanity. And this character, Adam, the author tells us, runs into a problem. The problem that he runs into ultimately is that he gets distracted or pulled away and enticed to then go and actually eat from this tree, which he was told that he wasn't supposed to eat from. But he ultimately eats from that tree, right? And he eats a fruit. A lot of people say that the fruit that he ate was an apple. I like to say it was an orange. I did a lot of research on that and did a lot of word study. And what I found is that oranges are a lot easier to draw than apples. So I like to say that it was an orange, But the orange or the fruit that he ate of that tree, we're told, actually introduced into the world sin. Sin is the natural inclination that all of us have to do the things that we weren't created for, but that we for some reason crave. To live in ways or make choices and do things that actually put us in a worse position than we started. To follow our desires instead of following the way we were actually created to live. And if you read the scriptures, what you find is that sin actually opened up this period of what's referred to as darkness in our world. And there was still light, but it didn't feel as bright as it used to. Now, man experienced the impacts of this and the repercussions of this. And we're told, if you study the scriptures, we see over and over again that God throughout, particularly the scriptures known in the Old Testament, that God sent guides to try to lead his people back to him. Right? We see that God sent a few different people. We see that he sent Abraham. He sent Moses. He sent the prophets. And all of them helped move the needle. And all of them led man back towards the way that man was created to live, but never actually fully got man there. And so ultimately, we read, if we study the scriptures, that ultimately God sent himself in the person of Jesus to come and lead mankind back to himself. To lead mankind back into a perfect relationship with him, back into the world as the world was created to be. And Jesus comes and he calls us to do one thing. He leads us to a point of action. It's the point of action that we've been talking about over the last 5 weeks. The point of action is this, simply to follow Jesus. To actually live in the way that he taught us to live in the way that he modeled for us, and to follow him back into life with our Creator. And our choice of whether or not to follow, if you study the scriptures, is going to do one of two things, right? Ultimately, it should lead us back into life the way it was created to be. Or it'll lead us to separation. If we choose to live away or apart from the way that Jesus calls us to live and invites us to live, we find ourselves continually separated from life as it was first created for us. And you got to understand, the worst thing in God's story is that you wouldn't experience life the way that he intended to give you life. And in fact, the author of John himself, said it like this, as if we keep reading. He said, the Word gave life. Again, he's referring to Jesus. The Word gave life to everything that was created. And his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness. The darkness can never extinguish it. Here's what you have to understand. This is a story about restoring the world to the way that the world was originally intended to be. This is a story about bringing everything back into the order that it was intended to have. This is a story about mankind experiencing relationship with mankind's creator in the way that it was originally created to experience it. And here's why this is so important for us, okay? Because the stories that you tell actually create the world in which you live. Like the way in which you choose to see the world actually affects the way that you experience the world. I mean, if perception is reality, then the way that you perceive this changes and shifts the reality that you find yourself living in. The world that you live in is created by the stories you tell. The stories you tell create the world in which you live. But can we be honest for a second? Do you know where most of us get our stories? Most of us get our stories right here. You haven't touched one of these in a long time, probably. No. Most of us actually get our stories from here, and here, and here, and here. And then we wonder why we're so stressed out, burnout, exhausted, anxious, tired, and confused, and afraid. You know what the problem is? We're reading the wrong story. Listen, all of these things are important. All of these things matter. I mean, when we experience hardship and tragedy and difficulty in our world, when we experience, quite honestly, darkness in our world, all of those things matter. And all of those should be important to us, and we should seek to do something about them. And also, we have to recognize that all of these things are really just one thing: scenes. They're scenes in the context of a much bigger story. I mean, by comparison, all of these things that we experience are like this, you know? But we find ourselves over and over again stuck in a scene, hyper-focused on one piece of the story and losing context for the bigger one. And you know what happens when you get stuck in a scene? You just look at it and you stare at it, and all you can see is hardship, and all you can see is brokenness, and all you can see is pain, and all you can see is difficulty, and all you can see is the hurt in our world. And if you don't step back and see the bigger story, what you find, you have nothing to hope for. We have to step back and see the bigger story. A few weeks ago, my first grader, Addie, came home from school. And she told us a story about what happened at school. And honestly, the story kind of frustrated me. I was like, I can't believe that happened. And we got to do something about this. And the Enneagram 8 in me, if that means anything to you, just started firing on all cylinders. I'm like, we got to fix this. So we reached out to the school. And the school was like, hey, yep, we're going to address this, blah, blah, blah. A few weeks later, she came home from school again, and she told me the same story again. But it had happened again. And I was like, I can't believe that has happened. And so we reached out to the school again. I'm so frustrated. I just can't imagine this happened, but it happened. And I'm so mad about it, right? And I reach out again to the school. And the school reaches back out. And here's what I found out. I found out that first graders don't always tell you the whole story. And the moment that happened, the moment I had the full story, all of the anxiety in me just dropped. All of the fear in me went away. All of the things I was stressed out for me just fell to the floor. Listen, if you're a follower of Jesus, just for a second, you have to recognize that you live in a world that doesn't have the whole story. You live in a world that's full of hopelessness because it's only looking at one scene, because it doesn't have a bigger context, because it's living right here. You live in a world that doesn't have the whole story. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you have to understand that you were called to be a storyteller. You were called to share good news with everyone around you. And do you know when the best time is to share good news? Every time you hear bad news, right? In fact, the author of Peter himself, one of the earliest followers of Jesus, wrote these words to some of Jesus' first followers. He put it like this. He said, and if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. In other words, when people are experiencing bad news, you ought to be the most hopeful. And if they say, man, things are so bad right now. Things are so hard right now. There's so much tragedy right now. And your response in that moment, if your response in that moment is, I know, right? It's so bad. Peter would say, you weren't ready. You got to be able to look at those moments and go, this is terrible. It's tragic. It's brokenness, it's darkness, it's real, and we should do something about it. But it's also not the full story. And things are going to get better. And then when they look at you like you have two heads, you get to tell them why. You get to tell them that they're living in a scene of a much bigger story. You and I were called to be storytellers. This is why Baptism Sunday is such a big deal around here. We make such a big deal about Baptism Sunday because these are moments where we actually get to see God's story in the way that it intersects with our stories. And some of us, quite honestly, we've been holding back from the step of baptism. And one of the reasons you've held back from the step of baptism is because you don't want to share your story, or you're afraid of getting in front of a bunch of people and sharing your story. And here's what I tell people over and over again when it comes to baptism and when it comes to sharing our stories. I tell them, hey, the reason that you need to share your story is because somebody else is living your story right now. They're just a few scenes back. And they need to see what God did with your scene and the way that he led you forward. And they need to see that there is a bigger story available to them in the same way that it was made available to you. Why? Because you and I were called to be storytellers. Now, if you're not a follower of Jesus, I'm so glad you're here. And there's a question that you are probably asking. It's a question that I would be asking if I were you. Honestly, it's the question that I asked when I was you. And the question I was asking when I was you was, how can you be so sure of this story? Because wanting a story to be true and having that story actually be true are two different things. Even longing for a story to be true and actually having it be true are not the same thing. And I just want to tell you that you couldn't pick a better time to ask that question. Because there is a piece of this story that actually serves as the foundation of the story and is the only reason that 2,000 years later we're still telling this story. And the foundation of this story is not Adam. And the foundation of this story is not Abraham or Moses or the prophets. And the foundation of this story is not even the crucifixion of Jesus when he was assassinated on a cross. Even secular scholars agree that Jesus was crucified on a cross. Josephus, one of the earliest Jewish historians, not a follower of Jesus, rejected Jesus, but still, when he wrote his historical accounts in practically real time, captured the crucifixion of Jesus. No. The crucifixion isn't even the foundation of this story. The foundation of this story is an event that took place 2,000 years ago that the people who saw it and experienced it could not wrap their minds around. And yet, based on everything they saw, could not imagine it not being true. They saw too much. They experienced too much. They witnessed firsthand too much to not believe it was true. It's an event that, honestly, I spent time over and over again in my life getting into the details and researching because I wanted to know if it was true. It's an event that we actually celebrate next Sunday as we gather for Easter. And I hope you'll be here to explore that event with us. And if you can't be here physically on Easter, I hope you'll watch the conversation online afterwards. Let me pray for us before we go. Jesus, I thank you for the ways that from the beginning of time to the end of time, you have pushed us and challenged us and encouraged us and reminded us to believe that there is a bigger story at play. God, for those of us in the room who find ourselves maybe stuck in a scene, maybe so focused on the things that are right in front of us, the brokenness that we're experiencing, the darkness that's right there in our worlds. God, for that person, would today be a day where their perspective is just widened? Would you help them to see the ways that you have been working from the beginning of time? Would you help them to see that the present reality that they're experiencing is not the end? Would you help them to see the ways that you have been revealing yourself to them over and over and over again? God, would you maybe even lead them to begin to follow you into a new chapter of your story, of their story? God, for those of us in the room who are surrounded by people who lack hope, would you give us the courage and the confidence to be a source of hope for them? God, would we be so hopeful that people can't help but ask us about it? Would we be so bold as to share why we're so hopeful? Jesus, we love you. We thank you for the ways that you continue to write our stories. It's in your name we pray. Amen.